Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism here at NYU and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. We care a lot about science communication around here, and we're very grateful to the Kavli Foundation for making this series possible. We've been doing it for many years now. And we even have a return. We've been doing it long enough that we even have a return visitor. Amy Dockser Marcus is here, who first joined us 10 years ago. And also Elaine Schattner is here. We're very grateful to have them both for a really important topic, which is sort of the changing power structure, I guess you could say, in how clinical medicine is researched and practiced here in the US and increasingly around the world. I will leave it to our moderator to formally introduce them, but I just want to say I'm very grateful to them both. And speaking of our moderator, she is the wonderful Robin Lloyd, who is a veteran editor and reporter, and is also a visiting scholar here at NYU. And I will turn over the proceedings to Robin. Take it away.
Hi, it's great to see everyone here, and thank you, and welcome to our online viewers as well. So this evening, the full title of our discussion is Storming the Lab, Understanding the Revolution in Patient-Led Healthcare. We're going to kind of be dancing around that. That's not the only thing we're going to talk about. I don't know if it's a revolution, but we're going to explore that. So what we're looking at, to elaborate a little, is the growth of the voices of patients and other advocates in interactions between everyday or lay people and doctors, biomedical research, and the public. The topic is strongly tied to discussions of patient empowerment, which you may have heard of, or e-patients was the big term about 10, 15 years ago, as well as to citizen science, which also kind of became common discourse in the last 5 to 10, 15 years. It's also related to basically the growing role of everyday people in public discourse, healthcare, medical practice, and biomedical research, part of which has been enabled by the internet, email, the web. So these two recent books that we're going to talk about tonight, and the themes from them, get into these topics. So the first book is right here. I loved reading both of these books. I recommend them. From Whispers to Shouts, The Ways We Talk About Cancer by Elaine Schattner, a journalist and former clinical oncologist. And also, we're going to talk about We the Scientists, How a Daring Team of Parents and Doctors Forged a New Path for Medicine by Amy Dockser Marcus, a journalist at the Wall Street Journal. So a little bit more background. Each book looks at the public discourse or patient voices and empowerment in the context of two very different diseases or conditions, if you will. Cancer in Elaine's book, I got permission for first names. Cancer in Elaine's book, a disease that, of course, is incredibly widespread globally. It's the number 2 cause of death in the United States, number 1 in Canada. I looked this up. It's a little lower in Mexico. We'll just start with those 3. Some cancers, as you know, are fairly curable right now or treatable, while others remain not so. In the case of Amy's book, we're looking at an ultra-rare progressive neurodegenerative disease that typically afflicts children, and it's called Niemann-Pick disease type C. It's got a long name, and so a lot of the times we might just call it NPC. NPC, the acronym. So I wanted you to have that, not be surprised when you heard NPC. So this disease is not curable for now. We're hoping that changes. That's exactly what the book is about. And we'll talk more about that. So Elaine's book looks at the public discourse and organizing around cancer throughout the 20th century to the present, a little bit before the 20th century too. And Amy's book looks at the past 20 or so years, so slightly different windows, though they overlap at the end. So both explore, as Amy wrote, quote, the history of modern science. Let me just say that better. Amy's book, in which she writes this: the history of modern science has been shaped by the separation of citizens from scientists. And Elaine notes in her book that, quote, as people with cancer are living longer, they are taking control not just of cancer conversations, but of research priorities. That's a big change. And it's happened, well, in your lifetimes and started in mine early on. So it's pretty remarkable change. So the biographical sketches, and then we'll get into our conversation. Elaine Schattner is a writer, cancer survivor, and former oncologist. She holds a master's degree from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Her freelance work has been published widely in The Atlantic, NPR, New York Observer, Scientific American, Washington Post, and beyond. As a Forbes contributor from 2014 to 2018, she covered news about cancer, novel drugs, diagnostics, and more. She had a blog called Medical Lessons, and she's a graduate of New York University School of Medicine, NYU, and she's a clinical associate professor of medicine at Weill Medical College. Amy Dockser Marcus is a health and science reporter for the Wall Street Journal, she's based in Boston. She frequently writes about gene therapy, citizen science, and rare diseases. She began her journalism career as a reporter for the American Lawyer in New York. Before joining the health and science team at the Wall Street Journal, she worked for 7 years in the newspaper's Tel Aviv bureau, covering Israel and the Middle East. In 2005, she won a Pulitzer Prize in the beat reporting category for a series of stories about cancer survivors and the challenges they faced in living with the disease. She also won the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Kavli Science Journalism Award for excellence in online writing. So I think I should have us start by just talking about these conditions that you wrote about, because they are quite different in some ways. One is very common, cancer, and one is very rare, NPC disease. So just to help us all initially, can you briefly sketch these conditions for the audience? Maybe who is affected, how difficult it is to get treatment, fatality, mortality, if you want to go there, it's pretty complicated, and access issues with treatment and care. I mean, that's kind of a lot, but just can you say a couple sentences about the conditions that you focused on? Because people need to get their heads around it to get started, I think.
Sure. Well, thank you, Robin, for that introduction. You all know that cancer is a common condition, and it affects about 2 million people in the United States each year. That is, there are 2 million new diagnoses, and around 600,000 people in the US will die from cancer this year. Globally, it's a growing problem, and so there are 20 million cases diagnosed each year, although it's underreported. And deaths from cancer around the globe are around 10 million, meaning half of people die with half the number of people diagnosed will die each year. What I think is important for journalists is to represent the diversity of cancer. I think the public understands now that cancer is not one thing. But even for doctors, there's education needed. And why it's important to represent the variety of cancers is that the treatments vary so much, and there are new treatments that are available that can really make the difference between a long life or not, depending on the specificity of the diagnosis and the appropriateness of the treatment given. Also, some people won't benefit from treatment. And to know the exact diagnosis that, and to know that there's nothing that will really help may aid families and patients to decide to skip care. So it's not just about the positive things, but about the negative things that people won't feel that they're throwing in the towel. I think that understanding the diversity of cases at the molecular level, at the scientific level, if you will, is really important. And that's happening, but not so much as I would like to see.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I see a lot of friends in the audience, which is great, and colleagues. Great. So NPC disease, we all have 2 NPC genes. We inherit one from our mom and one from our dad. And to get this disease, you have to inherit 2 mutated genes. So the parents usually only have 1 mutated gene, and they're fine. They're just carriers. They don't even know that they have a problem. But then when they get married and they have kids together, some of their children inherit 2 mutated copies and they get this disease. It's a cholesterol metabolism disorder. Basically what happens is that the cholesterol gets stuck in a compartment of the cell called the lysosome, which is supposed to act like the garbage disposal in a cell, but instead of processing all the cholesterol and sort of, sending it along its way to help the cell, gets stuck there. And as it gets stuck there, builds up. And many of these children appear typical at birth. Their parents do not have any idea that they have a fatal disease when they're born. It usually shows up in school. A teacher will call the parent and say, your kid is stumbling a bit in gym class, or your kid seems to be having some trouble, some difficulties remembering things in class. Many of them go on a diagnostic odyssey to get a diagnosis, and then when they get the diagnosis, it's shattering. The average age expectancy for someone diagnosed in early childhood is 19, but that has changed in recent years, in part because of the work of the families and the scientists that I describe in my book. And rare diseases, although this is a very rare condition, they don't have great numbers about it. Maybe 500 people in the world have this particular disease, but collectively, rare diseases in the United States alone affect over 25 million people. And that's part of the problem, is that it's very hard to get attention for rare diseases as individual diseases, and yet together they represent a really substantial public health problem.
So we're really used to this old thinking, I think, even young people today, that patients are like the objects of medical science, the objects of medical care. But your books are about how we've become the subjects or advocates for changes in care, changes in research. Can you sketch those changes that each of you identified, and then we'll drill down, but just give a couple examples, perhaps, major changes.
Sure. The changes in patient advocacy in my lifetime are enormous, and not just for cancer. I would say, although cancer is common, really you could say that it sets a model, if you will, for people with other conditions, just as AIDS does, which I hope we'll get to later. Patients today are very much aware of their rights, at least in North America they are. And I think that we shouldn't take that for granted. When I was in training, and let's say in the 80s, as a doctor, patients came in and they were very hesitant about asking questions. And a lot of doctors, a lot of the people who taught me to practice, really didn't have time for their questions. And then when the web happened and people started coming in with more questions and printouts of all sorts of stuff, a lot of doctors would just say, I don't have time for this. I think whether or not doctors like it now, it's understood that patients have the right to ask questions. Not only that, but patients come into offices much better informed than they used to be. So patients, until the 1990s, and even later in many instances, had to go to public libraries and search for information which was often not available to them. I have an acquaintance who went to the New York Academy of Medicine, where they had a library that was open for patients to use, and he had a lymphoma in the 1970s, and he and his wife looked stuff up there in that library. There's the famous story of Rose Kushner, a journalist who in Baltimore in the 1970s had breast cancer, and she went to the National Institute of Health, to the National Library of Medicine, where on campus they had physical copies of medical journals, and she looked up what to do. And all of this, I think, gradually became absorbed such that it's now normative for many patients, if they choose to look stuff up and come in with questions. And that happens at the individual level, and then also at the level of advocacy groups for people with particular diseases. And I think it's empowering for patients to have all that information, and I think doctors are coping with that for the most part.
I think as a society, we've become disillusioned with authority. We can't trust our government. We can't trust sometimes our teachers. We can't trust our parents sometimes. We can't trust the authority figures in our lives. And I think that has spilled over into medicine. We go into the doctor's office and we're not quite sure whether we're getting the full picture. We're not quite sure if our doctors are thinking about our needs or are being influenced by pharmaceutical companies or are being influenced by the priorities of the institutions where they work, which may not put our particular health concern in the foreground. What I'm writing about is actually goes beyond advocacy, which I think has been around for a really long time. I'm talking about patient-led research, patient-led movement. I mean, this is, in my opinion, revolutionary and is potentially transformative if we give it enough resources and support the people that want to do it. It's not for everybody. It's really hard to do. But the particular people that I focused on to illustrate the broader problems were parents of fatally ill children. I mean, there's a group of people who are highly organized and incentivized to not take no for an answer. And I think many of them were shocked when they learned not only was there not an effective therapy available for their children, that there wasn't anybody trying to find an effective therapy for their children. I think that piece of it was more upsetting than even learning that there wasn't an effective therapy.
So do you think, Amy, that the case, the disease that you focused on, that what's happening there is happening with other rare diseases or with other maybe not so widely prevalent as cancer diseases?
Absolutely. I wouldn't do a book just on a single disease for me. Like, you know, I'm a beat reporter, and I, you know, work for a newspaper where we think all the time, how can we engage people with the themes that we're writing about and that the stories we're doing? I never enter a story without thinking about those questions, whether it's a book or it's an article. So I always think to myself, if I had to pitch my editor, who's sitting in the audience here, you know, how can I persuade her to say yes? And I want to persuade other people to say yes to me too, not just her, but anyone who wants to pick up what I write. And so I didn't conceive this book as a book about NPC disease, even as important as I think the disease is and as moving as I found my experiences in the community. This is a book about what happens when we change the paradigm. What happens when we do science in a different way? What happens when we collaborate together? Doesn't matter if it's NPC disease or cancer or anything else. It's about collaboration, and we have to collaborate on every aspect of our lives. And that's the topic.
I'll ask you the same question, Elaine, in a second, but I just want to ask you to clarify that, because I think it was in your acknowledgments, I'm not sure, but you said something about how you had to sort of convince yourself that there was a book in this. What was that process like?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, the major issue I had in terms of a book is that, again, you know, with my background as being a newspaper reporter, got to be a beginning, got to be a middle, got to be an end. And when I was thinking about this story, I thought, what's the end? You know, I really didn't have an end. And it took me in part because it's so hard to get a drug approved by the FDA. And so I thought, and it can take so much longer than you ever imagined, even under the best of circumstances.
How long? Can you just give people a sense?
So on average, it can take 17 years. And, you know, that's a long time to write a book. So once I stepped back and I said, this isn't a book about whether the drug gets approved by the FDA or it doesn't get approved by the FDA, because if I wait for that, I won't have a book, because, you know, it'll be a long time. It's a book about, you know, how do we collaborate? How do we build, you know, relationships that are different, that can advance science and medicine in ways that help people who are alive now and benefit people who aren't sick yet or don't know they're sick yet. So once I reconceptualized sort of what I wanted to write a book about, I had a beginning, I had a middle, and I had an end, and I was off.
Very much the writer's experience, I find. So, no, really, you're like, there's nothing. Wait a minute. Elaine, you found that this, I mean, you just said it's incredibly generalizable. I mean, obviously, the AIDS epidemic and the whole national and global experience that happened with that and the changes that ACT UP and other advocacy and groups made to FDA and NIH policy, some of us might be familiar with that, remember that. It's still ongoing in some groups, but you have more to say about that. I think that this is really widespread in the cancer world and well beyond. the changing discourse, the impact of public conversations and framings of how we respond to diseases.
As I see it, the growing voice of patients reflects on progress. So one difference between cancer and Niemann-Pick disease type 3 is that there's been, in my lifetime, enormous progress against many forms of cancer. There has been some in the condition that Amy describes very beautifully in her, or sadly in her book. But because more people are alive after a cancer diagnosis and living longer, even with stage 4 disease, they are able on their own to voice their concerns, their questions, to make demands. And that can be, with the internet, they can do so constantly. Really, before COVID, there were some complaints I was privy to with just, there was too much chatter about cancer. It's not the only problem in the world. And I see that, and I think there's a certain self-centeredness, I hate to say this, but in any disease advocacy group, when you're pushing for research into your condition and payments for things to help you and not other people, you know, that is, you know, it's a self-serving agenda. It's understandable, and I'm very sympathetic to the needs of cancer patients. That's why I went into the field. But it's not the only problem in the world. About how much patients have influenced research, it's huge. I mean, for sure, patients now have a voice at the table. They have a place at the table where research grants are distributed and discussed. What's less clear to me is how much researchers, doctors, and basic science investigators actually listen to the patients' voices. So it's been a long time now that groups like the National Institute of Health and the American Cancer Society, other large organizations, include cancer patients and advocates on their boards. But sometimes they choose people who will just be head nodders. And I think that it's really essential that the organizations actually listen to the patients, because the patients' needs may not be the same as the doctors. You know, the purpose of research is not to serve doctors' careers. It's to help patients. Patients, on the other hand, don't have the same education, or at least most patients don't, as their doctors. So they may be naive, or they may just not have the knowledge in math or science that their doctors do. Unfortunately, as I read my book, I think medical education should be improved upon so that doctors could better understand the science and what needs to be done. The point is, there's an engagement now that didn't used to be present. And I think that's essential. May I give one example of that?
I would love it.
Yeah, so there's a group called MetaViver, which formed in 2009. It was formed by a group of people living with stage 4 breast cancer, mainly women, not entirely, or not exclusively. And they were fed up with what they perceived as the focus of research in breast cancer, having to do with just prevention and detection and treatment of early stage disease. So they formed a group to focus and fund research for stage 4. And now that organization, which was just a handful of people, gives millions of dollars in research grants to scientists around the country and world. And you know, they choose what they think is important. It's a lay-led board, and that's really happening. Yeah.
It's MetaViver, right?
MetaViver.
Yeah, okay, great. Amy, I think your book talks about much more than a seat at the table was achieved by the folks that you focus on. Can you talk about that? I mean, they actually changed which drugs were used, who was eligible for them, who was included in clinical trials and experiments on testing the safety and efficacy of drugs?
Yeah, I think, yeah, seat at the table is insufficient, in my opinion, and you know, because when you have a seat at the table, often, you know, you get sort of drowned out because you're not treated as an equal partner. And I think that you need to be treated as an equal partner. I was impressed by the amount of science that the group of parents were able to produce. They didn't want to just be consumers of scientific knowledge, they wanted to be producers of scientific knowledge. And they argue that that is the right of all of us as patients and as citizens and as people. We have the right to produce science. How do you go about doing that? They read all the scientific papers. They, you know, I always encourage people, and I tell them, I don't have a science background, and I read science papers all the time. If you concentrate, you can figure it out. You can read a science paper, you can ask questions, you can understand it. And they did. They went in depth. They interviewed and reached out to all the researchers. They got ideas. They gathered all of the medical records of their children and combined them together looking for patterns. They thought about, they brought in other scientists from other diseases. Once they got an understanding of what it meant, a cholesterol metabolism disorder disease, they found other scientists working on other cholesterol metabolism disorder diseases, brought them in to ask them questions. They raised a ton of money, and they prioritized experiments that they wanted done. And they often, the scientists, I found that with the tensions that often arose were when the parents, wanted to really be partners. Like, they wanted to analyze the information together. They wanted to talk about the results together. They wanted to set the research agenda together. Some of the parents, by the way, ended up being co-authors of peer-reviewed scientific papers, which, that is a form of, producing generalizable knowledge that benefits the wider community. So, I make the argument that, again, I don't think everyone has to do this, because I want to be sensitive to the fact that when you're ill, or when you're the parent of a very ill child, you shouldn't have to do this. But for people that wanted to do it or felt that they could make a contribution, I think that they should be not only encouraged but supported. And I get into in the book some ideas on how to support them to do this even better.
And just for balance, before I turn to questions, I want to ask about, are there drawbacks to this change? Is it too much influence? It definitely is eroding, or it's modifying, maybe is a better word for it, some of the gold standard approaches to a clinical trial, to research that looks into the safety and effectiveness or efficacy of a drug. So, are there drawbacks? Does this influence become problematic for the generation of reliable knowledge? Does it become problematic source of influence on where funds go? Or is it just entirely, this has got to happen, this is very positive, we need to go this direction for a long time?
Okay. I think overall, the involvement of patients and parents, of the caregivers in research is a positive force. But there are risks, and so a number of people have looked into the funding of certain patient advocacy groups by industry. And that's, I think, a potential source of bias on the parts of patients. It affects what patients learn, hear, and then what they choose as their research priorities. And I think, for journalists, when you interview doctors, you might now say, oh, do you get funding from any drug company? I think the same should be asked of patients. Do you receive any support from pharmaceutical companies for travel, for whatever? Because that happens a lot and increasingly. I think it's an interesting interaction, as I write in the book. I think the lines between industry and advocacy are getting very blurry, because basically the patients who are surviving on some of the new drugs are showcasing how effective the drugs are. So it's useful for pharma to have them out there telling their stories, and it's like a love fest. If you go to some conferences, the pharmaceutical companies support the patients, and the patients are appreciative and glad for the chance to feel important, and they are important. Each of us is important. People want to have to matter, and so they like sharing their stories. And so that interaction is sort of loaded and potentially problematic. I also want to point out, at the level of just patient knowledge and participating in decision making, which I think is essential, it puts a heavy burden on patients or parents in the case of some conditions. If used to be that doctors shouldered the burden of medical decision making, and that was hard. But now really the onus is on patients and their families, and if someone does well, great. But if someone does poorly, the guilt of that may be really terrible to live with. And so I think that's a downside also of all the information and involvement in decision-making.
So I'm here tonight because I want you all to think about what it means to call something the gold standard. Who defines what a gold standard is? The people in power. And how do they decide that? Based on their values and the things that they think are important. Randomized clinical trials are very important, but they're also a bubble. They're hard to replicate. They weed out lots and lots of people because they need everything to be homogeneous. They require you to live close to an academic center primarily, so they're skewed. They don't represent the general population usually. I could go on and on about how the gold standard's not as golden as you've been led to believe. So I'm not saying to throw out everything. I'm saying to challenge. I'm saying to be a skeptic. I'm saying to go in and to really assert and think about what values are most important to you, and then to see how you can achieve those goals. I think I agree with what Elaine said, that patients and patient advocacy groups can have as many conflicts of interest as doctors. And I'm all for disclosure of all parties on where money comes from. But, one of the stories I like to tell is at a conference, there was a patient advocate on the panel, and she had been asked, to give the patient point of view. And one of the things she said at the conference was, she said, everyone in this office, how many of you took a vacation day to come to this scientific conference and present here? No one raised their hand. How many of you people, had to ask your boss for the day off and get a babysitter and come here? And how many of you people are, getting salaries, essentially being paid to sit in this office, to sit at this conference and present your findings and whatever? No one pays me. I had to take a vacation day. I had to ask my boss for the day off. So again, I just want to. I feel like it's very hard for patients to be allowed. And I don't think it's just. I want to also say that they're not just contributing stories; they're data. They're contributing data. When we say they're contributing stories, we almost lower the value of what they're doing. So what I'm saying is, I'm not trying to disparage doctors. I have great ones, I love them, and rely on them for many, many reasons. What I'm saying is that to really be partners, what does it mean to be a partner? What does it mean to be a collaborator? In most of our personal relationships, whether it's at work or at home or friendships, when we're partners with someone or collaborators with someone, it's just like a messy process. Because we all have opinions, and we all, but we value the expertise that our colleagues have that we lack. We value, our friends and our families and partners' perspectives. Like, what I'm arguing for is just, I'm not saying that doctors shouldn't heal, and I'm not trying to put down their wonderful qualifications, because they're amazing and they're educated and stuff. What I'm arguing for is an elevation and recognition of the fact that patients also have expertise and can contribute and be partners.
But it is bumpy early on, as your narrative pointed out. Some of the kids who were the very first to get cyclodextrin, for instance, is one of the drugs that you focused on. We don't know what caused what, and there was some genetic evidence afterward to indicate a predisposition. But during the treatment, one of the young kids gets liver cancer and dies from that, potentially due to the toxicity of the treatment. It was at half the dose, I think you said, that the physician, the researcher wanted, and yet there was this outcome. That would be considered, could be considered a mistake, a failure, if you're not thinking carefully about causality and correlation. Get me out of that hole. Explain why that was not,
Well, that child that you're referring to was enrolled in a formal clinical trial at the National Institutes of Health. No, he was enrolled in a clinical trial.
Yeah, but there were no cat and dog, you said that would usually be an intermediate step. Instead, they jumped.
No, that there was cat and dog data, and then they moved into that formal trial. But to your larger point, which is this, anyone who enrolls in a clinical trial knows that the risk is greater than the benefit. If they thought the benefit was greater than the risk, they'd give you the drug. You're in a trial because they don't know. And whether you do that trial by through compassionate use with FDA and organizing a group of people that are all going to get compassionate use permission from FDA, and the doctors are going to, try to standardize how they collect your data, or you enroll in a randomized clinical trial.
So this is all before authorization or approval of a drug?
Yes. I mean, there were two parallel tracks that were going on. There were children that enrolled in a formal trial, and that trial was in the hopes that FDA would eventually approve the drug. And there were children who didn't qualify for that trial or didn't want to wait until the trial was open, and they collaborated as a group of doctors and got compassionate use permission from FDA and tried to standardize their data. Now, the FDA itself told the parents and the scientists that both forms of data were important and that they would weigh both forms of data when they were considering approval for the drug. But what I'm saying is, the bottom line is that when you enter a clinical trial, there's a high chance that nothing good is going to happen. And that's the sad, sad story of Elaine's book is filled with a whole generation of children that died because they didn't know how to treat them, and their parents put them in trials and hoped for the best. I mean, it's devastating. It's devastating what happens, but that's the way it is with trials.
Do you have anything to add, Elaine? It sounds like
Yes, I do. And this is partly in response to what you asked about randomized controlled trials, which are taught as the gold standard. And I share Amy's ambivalence about them. I mean, of course, it's great if you can conduct an RCT. And if you in medical school, that's what we're taught, that's the highest form of data. However, at least in oncology, which is what I know best, a lot of the randomized trials are problematic, even the phase 3 studies. Often the control arm is either old, or it's a choice of drug combination that may be designed to show a benefit. Just because something is randomized, even with a placebo, doesn't mean it's a good study. I think rather transparency and full disclosure of data and enrolling a representative sample of patients and being rapid in communicating toxicity and positive effects and negative effects are essential. And I don't think it matters so much anymore if it's a phase 1, 2, or 3 study. There are, in effect, through what's called real-world evidence now, some AI companies and let's just call it health tech companies are mining our data for what's the best drug. As a friend of mine said, she has stage 4 breast cancer. She was a founder of MetUp, a group that was modeled after the AIDS activists. She left that group, but anyway, she said, Netflix knows what movie I want to watch. Why can't my doctor tell me what drug best matches my particular cancer, which has been biopsied 20 times, and all this information you have about me? And in fact, the information are there. When you send in a pathology sample at a hospital or through a network, the information is mined by pathology companies and drug companies, but no one is allowed to access that information, and the information tends to be private and siloed. So if that information could be accessed, and you could make comparisons with decent controls, I think similar quality with different issues than the standard RCT. It would be cheaper, it would be much faster, and it would be better for patients. I also worry about the ethical risks of randomized clinical trials, that essentially patients are at risk for being used by the trialists. When I was an oncology fellow, I used to say there were two kinds of oncologists who were an academic. Some were like steel, And they could put people on trials and just stomach the worst side effects and bad outcomes and just keep enrolling them until they fulfilled the number of enrollees they were supposed to register. And others couldn't handle the trials, preferred to avoid that. We like to treat each patient sort of in a personalized way. And I think that there is a risk of dehumanizing patients by enrolling them in trials where they may get a placebo or an old drug that the doctor knows will not work. I think that you risk using people, and that disturbs me from a medical ethics standpoint.
Sure. Dan, did you want to say something?
Yes. In an effort to get people to start asking questions, I'll ask the first question. So line up behind me. So the old ecosystem of how biomedical research was funded was profoundly biased. We know this. It was biased by drug industry. It was biased by clinicians. It left patients out. The new ecosystem includes some patients, but it retains some of the worst features of the old ecosystem in the sense that people who are low information patients, patients who are, lack societal privileges, people who lack access to the political system, they're just as excluded, and I think possibly more excluded under the new ecosystem than under the old. So while it makes great sense to include patients, we're not really including all patients. We're only including patients who have the information and the money and the time to involve themselves. So where does that leave us, really? And should we really be as enthusiastic about this new arrangement when the deepest problems are still unresolved? And I think you could argue farther from power than they were before, when more clout rested with the funding agencies. I should say even farther, because it's not like under the previous system their thoughts and needs were paramount. Far from it.
Okay, so Dan, I think you raised such incredibly important points, and I share your concern and fear that even this kind of newer model is not doing a good enough job in being inclusive and allowing everybody access. I think that you can only try to do your best to change the system. Like, even if you fail or fall short, you have to keep trying to change the system. I don't consider myself an enthusiast of this new approach because I'm really not enthusiastic about anything. As a skeptical reporter, we can't be enthusiasts of anything, but I certainly am a critic, a sharp critic of the old system, and see at least some promising things in the new system. One of the things that, because the group that I was writing about in terms of this collaboration, because one of their main collaborators was a scientist at the NIH, and he took it very seriously that he had a public responsibility to to at least allow a lot of people to benefit, not just parents with children with a rare disease. One of the things that they did is they created a patient toolkit that's available at the NIH on the website for free, that they have created not just with this group of NPC families, but with families and patients and caregivers from a range of diseases. And this patient toolkit provides resources and really steps, walks people through. Here's how you can get access to a scientist. Here's how you can reach out to a researcher. Here's resources that you can do. It's on the NIH website. Now, is that good enough? No, of course not. Are the people that need it most perhaps not even going to find it? Most assuredly so. I mean, they need to do much better outreach. But at least it exists. I'm in favor of the change that happened during COVID, that all of these science these scientific journals allowed scientists to post their papers prior to going through peer review. And not only did it open it to a more public forum of peer review because people jumped in even, in early stages of the papers, but it gives access to people who want to get educated about it. It's outrageous and ridiculous that scientists who got NIH funding to do their studies publish their papers in journals that you have to pay $50 a shot for every paper. That's not sustainable or accessible for patients. They should have access for free to NIH-funded studies that get published. I mean, I don't know how to solve that problem either, but I'm just saying I thought it was great that, that's online now, because at least, you can get access to things if you know where to look, if you know, and a lot of people don't know where to look. That's what just is so, and you know what? We didn't talk about this, but like, I had a personal experience. My mother was diagnosed with a rare cancer, and you know what? I know where to look. I'm a really good looker, and I wasn't, and I failed her. I found nothing. With all of the ways that I know how to call people, and I'm not shy about cold calling, I just utterly failed. And one of the things I think about to this day, so many years after she died, is like, I know how to ask questions, and I'm not scared to. And so what? And even I came up very, very short. So what about all these people that don't even know what question to ask? So I thank you for raising that, because I think about it all the time.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that, as you realize, access to cancer care is a challenging issue. So as far as just state-of-the-art modern care, a lot of people, I think, are wary of physicians, as was evident during the COVID epidemic and still. People don't trust doctors. When I was researching my book, I watched old movies where people would say things like, I don't want to be a guinea pig. People were afraid of being placed in cancer or entering cancer hospitals because they didn't want research to be done on them. They feared research and they feared medical institutions. And I think that those fears still exist and are one of the reasons or non-reasons why people who are of marginalized communities, of color, of various minority groups may be more reluctant to get either standard care on grid, so to speak, or experimental care, even more so on clinical trials. And so I think overcoming the trust barrier is essential, and I think there's a role for journalists in that. But I also think that if people could get to know their doctors better, they would trust them more. And unfortunately, the way medical systems are today, I know I spend more time than I care to in doctors' offices, and it's horrible. The doctor has 20 minutes, and it's hard. I feel like with some of my doctors, I don't know them, and I trust them less, and they care less about me because they know me less than my older doctors, and that's disturbing, and I think it diminishes the quality of care and makes it less likely that people will accept optimal care if it's offered to them. Ivan?
Thanks very much. It's been fascinating so far, and I'm sure will continue to be fascinating. I am wondering, and this question is for either of you, but might be a bit more in your experience, Amy, because you've covered Lyme disease, of course, going back many years. And what I'm asking about is not Lyme disease specifically, but as an example of a sort of a field, a condition where there is deep factionalization. I don't think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that either of you are focused on conditions that, or diseases that people say, please don't find a cure for this. Now, it may be, of course, as you and I both know, Elaine, that there are treatments that are not sort of good fits for people. That's different from a group of people actually saying, please don't find a better treatment. Please don't find a cure. So I edit a publication called Spectrum, which is about autism research for autism researchers. And we see there, much like we've seen in the deaf community over time, these factions where there is a significant, or even more than one faction that essentially says, you know, don't do any of this kind of research, don't do any of genetics, for example. If you talk about genetics and autism research, you are essentially, not essentially, they actually go out and say you are practicing eugenics. A major study in the UK never started because there were such protests. And I'm wondering if either of you really can reflect on, again, going back a little bit to Robin's question about what are the potential, it's not exactly a downside as much as what should we be thinking about in terms of what I think, I agree with both of you that on balance this is an incredibly important thing that has to happen. But it also has led to some fairly uncomfortable situations, for lack of a better term. How do we grapple with that? How do we sort of, you know, think about that and get to a place where people are more comfortable and actually can have dialogue and not sort of shout each other down? Because that, I don't think, is really what anyone really wants.
Okay. Thanks so much, Ivan, for that simple question. I'm not sure if this will answer it, but I'll try, at least with cancer. I'll give you a moment to think, Amy. In my book, I described the splintering of cancer groups. So initially, there was just basically one cancer charity, and then there was a group of, the Leukemia Foundation was founded in New York City in the 1950s, and then more and more there was a group of parents of children with cancer, and then there were like breast cancer organizations, and the 90s, lots of prostate cancer organizations and so forth. And within even each broad cancer type, there are communities which have different priorities, different values, different, you know, some want prevention, some want genetic tests, some want just focus on stage 4 and treatments, some want rapid FDA access to drugs, some want very slow-paced, methodical research. People have different values. So in answer to your question, I think that unless we change human nature or just become all one, you know, that's not going to be fixed, and people will support different organizations that fund the research they want, or not.
Yeah, I share a lot of the feelings that Elaine said, because even within this small group of parents, they did not, you know, always agree. And I think that that was one of the surprises, that, you know, you think to yourself, what's there to disagree about? We want to save these children's lives. And yet how to go about doing that and what that would mean, and, you know, the different levels of, you know, risk-taking and long-term versus short-term, I think affected people. But I think, more broadly speaking, often people yell because they don't feel heard. And I think that when people feel heard, they don't yell as much. And so I'm very much in favor of increasing the amount of talking and communication. I think that it's almost unfortunate that kind of the first major conversation seems to end up at an FDA advisory council meeting. Seems to me that you ought to talk a lot more before you ever get to that meeting. And if you had forums where you could discuss some of the most contentious issues, I think it would help go a long way. Because, you know, I think there's ways, you know, you can't always have consensus, but I like to think of Venn diagrams. You know, if we have more conversations, we can at least expand that circle in the middle where, you know, okay, I can get on board with that. You know, let's disagree on this thing on this part or that thing on that part, but here's where we do agree, and here's where we can be collaborators. I try to be more proactive along that rather than thinking I'm ever going to persuade everybody to think the same way.
May I add just one point? Which, this is a little heavy, Ivan, but this is from my personal experience, so I was diagnosed at a young age with breast cancer. I had scoliosis diagnosed at age 6. I was hospitalized for a long time as a kid. I've had a lot of medical problems, some as a consequence, I think, of the treatments, and some from probably genetics. And I worry about eugenics a lot and all the gene testing we do, which would apply to children with inherited disorders and to adults and their families. You know, I might have been deleted if people had known what my medical fate would be. And I value my life. I don't want that. And I think if you're talking about children with autism or with any condition for which there may or may not be a genetic cause, there's a risk in that information. So I think we, you know, it's hard to stifle science, and I don't know that we should, but I think there is a real risk of information which leads to, certainly people may have their, you know, be marked, so to speak, by their illnesses, whether we do the gene testing or not, and that's a real ethical problem. Thank you for raising it.
I'm an editor at the Wall Street Journal. Amy is my colleague. I thought, Elaine, what you said about you know, the advocacy, putting the burden on the family members. You know, like, did you spot everything? Did you do the right things? I thought that was really a good point. And what I see is that in hospitals, is still a very old-fashioned system. I mean, you can have like someone who has 17 family members, they're there all the time. But you also have very small families now, like one person, and they can't be there maybe when the doctor comes, because you don't know when the doctor is going to come. So I'm wondering, and from both of you, have you seen any, you know, changes in the logistics of being able to communicate in a way that makes sense in the modern world with people who can't be there 24 hours waiting? So.
You point to a real problem. Communication in hospitals is horrible. It tends to be condescending. Doctors expect patients to be available whenever they happen to call or around at whatever hours. I can tell you from my experience that I didn't do this, but many doctors choose to round very early in the morning so that the patients will not be there. The families, that is, the patients should be there. And that, yeah. You know, it's a strategy. I was told to do that, you know, by more than one teacher. And that really happens, and I think now doctors are even more pressed for time than they were. And not only that, but when you're in the hospital, you don't have your usual doctor. So right. I wish I had a fix for that, except I'm of the school that there should be more physicians, that physicians should have fewer patients per person, and they should have more time to spend answering their patients' questions. But, you know, that's a dream.
I'd like to have more social workers in hospitals who can advocate on behalf of patients, and you know, I think that's really important. And I'd also like patients to be informed about the ombudsman at the hospital so that they can bring their concerns and complaints. I mean, I think that there should be almost like, there probably is a patient bill of rights, but it should be, but if there isn't one, there should be one, and if there is one, it should be more like, patients should be informed about what their rights are.
You're learning this for the first time.
Yeah.
When you're doing it. You can't know all this stuff. That's
Yeah.
the problem.
I mean, you take a taxi in New York City, you got a Bill of Rights right there in front of you.
Yeah, yeah, but
How hard should that
Yeah.
be in a hospital?
yeah. But you know, we all need advocates. I mean, and I feel like we're all going to be patients. If we aren't already, we will be. So, you know, I think that it's on all of us to try to, like, you know, improve the system. And I know it requires more money too, but I really wish that every patient could be assigned some sort of like social worker if they're going to be you know, hospitalized. They really need someone who can argue for them.
Hi, thanks so much for talking about this. It's so interesting. I was curious about, I guess, sort of where we're talking about this revolution happening, if this is mostly a United States thing that we're seeing, if it's happening in other countries, or if there are other countries that are way ahead in this space and that we could be learning from. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it is happening in other countries. There are in the rare disease world, there are rare disease groups, and there's like a European rare disease group, and then there's countrywide rare disease groups. because of the internet, people are able to sort of join forces, and especially for rare diseases, there's been efforts to work together more closely, as well as the regulatory agencies. The FDA and the European regulatory authorities do try to work more closely than they have in the past with, especially with rare diseases. But I think that the phenomenon has been driven more strongly in the United States, in part because it often requires raising a lot of money. And that's, that's something that I think a lot of US-based groups and individuals are willing to do. And some of the individuals even are they're so well off that they're able to like single-handedly fund something. So, that has been one of the reasons why I think that it has been focused so much in the United States. But, I was just in Switzerland talking to people about some of the themes in the book, and they're doing things there too. I mean, it is happening around the world.
Next question.
Hi. You mentioned before about how there's most people of color do not trust doctors and don't want to like deal with them. I was wondering if you have like any ideas in what type of ways that gap could be closed, because at least for my culture, most people don't believe doctors actually like they know doctors do stuff, but they don't really trust and don't really want to go to hospital much, and they rather just stay at home and.
Yeah, let's just be direct and clear. That mistrust is earned. It was hard won, right? Because of the Henrietta Lacks story is the classic story that we all are familiar with now, but people of color and low-income people have been abused. Their rights have been taken away. They've been dehumanized in a lot of drug experiments, a lot of medical studies. There have been people of color and low-income people often in this country are excluded from healthcare. They're not given fair access to insurance, to jobs, to wealth. I mean, this is hard earned, but I think you're talking about solutions to this, or what needs to happen next to try to do better.
I think education would help a lot. I'm an advocate of public education, and if people could understand what doctors were saying, that would help, and that would narrow the gap between patients and physicians. I also think that programs of promoting diversity and equity in medical schools will help too, because it's important that the physician and nursing and the workforces include people who everyone can relate to. And yeah, the more inclusive, the better. All of that will take time. I wish there were an easy solution.
Yeah, I agree. I think there has to be more attention paid to, you're more likely to trust a doctor who looks like you, lives in your community, shares your background, speaks your language even. Like, I would like to see hospitals have more people on staff who can speak a variety of languages, and I think that people should, again, with the social worker, also be assigned someone if, that speaks another language if you need help with another language. I think also that Elaine touched on this before, which is doctors don't get to spend enough time with us. One of the ways that you foster trust is just talking to a patient about who they are when they're not in the doctor's office, because who you are when you're not in the doctor's office informs the choices you make when you are in the doctor's office. And so it always sort of blows my mind that doctors wouldn't, I don't want to say they wouldn't want to know that, because they're lovely people. They should want to know that, and they're probably not given enough time to know that. But I think it should be encouraged in their medical training that they should spend time knowing about that, because, again, people are always saying patients are non-compliant, right? They don't do what I say, they're non-compliant. Are they non-compliant? Or are you missing something about their essential life and their values that is making them act in a certain way? Maybe they can't afford the medication, maybe they can't get there, maybe they didn't understand your instructions and they were too embarrassed to ask. Like, that even happens to me sometimes. I don't understand and I feel like, oh, I can't ask that again. So all these things I think will go towards those changes. But yeah, it's not going to be a quick fix.
Yeah, great question. Obviously, equity at all sorts of levels are going to be necessary and important, and I don't think we have to wait a really long time for them. We didn't wait a long time to develop drugs for the condition that Amy has written about, and that's partly a result of affluence. The people who were able to advocate, there were little signs that had a fair amount of access to funding, right? So we need equity at a lot of different levels to come about with change. But I do want to say that there's evidence that physicians we're definitely seeing a lot more representation of a lot more demographic groups and nationalities and international representation in our healthcare force, obviously, at a lot of different levels. And I live near a medical college in the Bronx, and I'm seeing mostly young doctors of color, and I'm thrilled to see that because we need to fill that gap among many. Do you have more to say, or? All right, great question, thanks.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm not a student here, but I'm considering applying, but I wrote my question down. So this is probably more for Amy, but I'm interested in both of your perspectives, of course. So early on, you talked about how rare diseases individually are very rare, but together they make up 25 million, I think it was, in the United States. But during the conversation, the idea of conflict of interest that exists between patients of various disorders, diseases, was brought up. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how people with rare diseases can be in community with each other, and perhaps even how we can work together despite that conflict of interest.
That's a great question, really important question. I think that there's room for doing both, right? To advocate for an individual disease and also to join in a larger community. One of the things that I've noticed, and this gets into the sort of like how can we support people that want to be more involved and to be producers of knowledge, not only consumers. There has been more investment by philanthropists in creating networks. So they'll invest money in these individual groups to allow them to get their group up and going. But as part of that investment, they form a network, like a rare disease network, because there are common learnings and common experiences. There are sometimes diseases are on the same pathway, and so even if it's a different disease, some of the information could benefit others. But I think that that's one way to kind of like multiply the multiplier effect here is, if philanthropists will invest more in the creation of networks to enable sharing of findings and even common practices, best practices, so people don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time, I think that would go a long way to achieving, the goals that you're describing.
Thanks. Philanthropy is playing an important role. There's so much income and wealth disparity in the United States that unless you have access to personal wealth, you're gonna need some support from a nonprofit, from a foundation. So, the conflicts are always there. The question is, where's that line too much conflict? When do we say that's too much collusion, that's too much collaboration, and when do we say that this lift was really important, that aid, nothing would have happened without that aid. Who are we going to collaborate with? From whom do we accept that aid? These are some of the questions I'm thinking about too. Next.
Hi, I'm curious if there's any changes you would like to see from the FDA level, so from a more of a top-down level, because from my understanding, they are much more conservative with the type of data they want, the type of experiments they want done to approve a drug, which you could argue that is a good stance to have, but it seems like a lot of the changes are kind of going up against what the FDA will be okay with and won't be okay with, so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what they should reform.
I mean, Amy's book is directly about this. You have this is so cool, this material that your folks did.
Sure. Okay, the issue of FDA drug approvals is often in the news. It's of interest to investors, which drives traffic for journalism, but it's really important for patients. And I am sympathetic to patients' perspectives. In my book, I quote Larry Kramer, who was the founder of ACT UP, the AIDS organization, and he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about how patients with terminal illnesses don't have time to wait for randomized clinical trials. And he was very adamant about the need for patients to get the drugs that they thought was best. And I think the public at large was sympathetic to the needs of AIDS patients, more so maybe than they are to the needs of cancer patients and people with some other conditions. And I want to say that my concern for journalism is that there's a conflation. So from the FDA's point of view, I think there are people who say they're approving things too fast, and there are other people who say they're approving things too slowly. I think that's a big topic for tonight. But what I would say for journalists is that I have observed a conflation in news stories and in opinion also about the cost of cancer drugs and the efficacy, meaning how well they work. So I believe that a lot of the new cancer drugs and the new tests to make diagnoses, carefully, are very helpful to patients. And if they're somewhat helpful, if they add, let's say, 6 months of life, or they're promising, in some cases they may add years, people need to know that, including policymakers, because in my view, the costs of the drugs are too high, the prices are too high, and policymakers, if they believed that they were worthwhile having those drugs and those tests, would do maybe more to bring the prices down. But if you conflate those issues and you say they're so expensive and they only add 2 months of life, which tends to be an underestimate, I think that I have friends who are alive because of new drugs, many. And I think that the problem is most people don't have access to the latest treatments. But my point is I think that the FDA should make available to patients drugs that have been vetted for safety, and in my view, not worry so much about the efficacy. And the problem then is how we pay for these things, which is a real problem.
Yeah, that's one of the sort of, I think, a big problem too. I mean, with FDA, so we're so under-resourced on like all of these things that like, I think FDA needs a huge infusion of cash to do more things. That's like one major thing that would help. But because here's one of the things, particularly with rare diseases, it can take a really long time to determine that it really is having a benefit. You can have signals of benefit, but you don't quite cross the threshold. And then the FDA is in this real dilemma because the parents or the patients, the caregivers really do feel and even gather data about that in their lives it's making a difference, and yet it doesn't meet the statistical model. So if you had a more robust FDA, you could get these conditional approvals where FDA says, you know what, this is a lethal disease and we don't have any other drugs that are approved. There's nothing going on. This does have some really robust and promising data that has signals that it's doing something. Let's give you a conditional approval, but you have to keep gathering data for another 5 years and we're going to pull the drug. But they'd have to really pull the drug, which they often don't do. They'd have to invest in this, the gathering of the data. There was a drug that for an NPC disease, before the one that I talk about in the book, this was a drug that had already been approved by the FDA for Gaucher disease, and it was showing promise in mice for NPC disease. So the company said, hey, let's try to test this in NPC patients. It's already an approved drug. It failed to get FDA approval because it had strong signals of efficacy, but didn't cross the statistical threshold. They didn't approve it. The European Union did approve it, under condition that they would collect data for the next 10 years. The scientists and the doctors, they were seeing benefit in their patients. They kept prescribing it off-label because it was an FDA-approved drug for Gaucher disease. So their patients kept getting it, but the insurance companies didn't always cover it. Again, the accessibility issue. In the meantime, after 10 years, the scientists gathered all the data that had been collected in the European Union, and you know what? They showed with statistical significance, it did. It improved swallowing, it improved, all kinds of symptoms of the disease. But that kind of thing has to be done more. Instead, we're in this terrible situation where, they don't know what to do when it's kind of close but not over the finish line.
I mean, that one worked, but it could end up being false hope. But I guess you're arguing for let's go find out?
I'm not saying based on hope. I'm saying based on science. They had animal data, they had patient data. You know, they had data that appeared that there was benefit. So, you know, I'm not saying across the board, you'd have to weigh it based on each individual case. But what I'm saying is some creativity and some flexibility and some new thinking and some more resources. Just a little thing, just a few things. But I do think that, you know, if we're committed to improving the health of all of us, then we have to come up with some new ways of doing it, you know. There's no panaceas here, but I think that we could be more creative in trying to run some experiments on improving things.
Next question.
Hi, thank you for the conversation today. It's been really interesting. I was really interested in when you mentioned about the benefits of having preprints available to the general public. In my experience at the time, it caused a lot of the spread of misinformation, and a whole bunch of those studies have also since been retracted. So I'm really interested in how we can democratize research responsibly and give people the tools for scientific literacy, sort of like creating a WebMD for PubMed, maybe. How do we do that?
You want me to go first? Or you okay, so, you know, there's no way to do any of these things perfectly. And especially during COVID, which is when these, you know, when some of this started happening with giving greater access and putting papers online, there was so little knowledge that, of course, some things were going to turn out to be wrong. But I have to tell you that the official scientific literature is rife with false papers that should have been retracted years ago and aren't. I mean, that's the nature of science. You do your best with what you know at the moment, you build on things before, and then you keep going because the knowledge and your conclusions change as more information comes in. I think that the only way to do all of this is, again, to make things accessible to more people so that they can participate in a more robust process, that they can ask more questions. I mean, to use the internet more to create forums, you know, where, you know, we had patients like me that became something else, but like these concepts where people can join in trusted groups and have access to information. We're always going to have misinformation. We're always going to have bad actors who try to misinform us. But, you know, I just err always on the side of greater access to information. And I guess I also, like I said, you know, because so much of the official literature's incorrect, it doesn't scare me so much, what you're talking about. I feel like we can get through it.
I think that's very well put. I might just add that doctors, I think, need to be skeptical of what they read. You know, medical school now has been shortened in many places, and sometimes people just go through 3 years. There are more people who major in humanities, which is nice. But doctors need the skills in statistics and biology to be able to understand what they're reading. And too much of the time that may or may not happen. Also, they're hurried. So I think for doctors to help patients navigate all the misinformation, which is out there in published literature, I think the preprints are just an example. The doctors need to be, in my view, better educated in math and science than is currently happening. Yeah. Ish.
Question actually sort of follows up on that. I think we saw during the COVID pandemic, not just how misinformation spread, but how patients feeling like they had a voice to advocate for their own science spread misinformation by rallying other patients into their misinformation, right? Whether out of denial of the disease or extreme caution out of the disease, they spread demonstrably false information and felt like they had sort of a right to do so, to advocate for themselves, but in that sense, they hurt people, not just themselves, but other people. So how do you sort of reckon with this idea of like wanting to make sure that people have the ability to feel like they can do and research and learn what they need to do and, you know, push back against authority when it's not moving fast enough or doing what it needs them to do, but also like maintaining a sense of rigor so that people don't get swept up in other patients spreading false information.
All right, well, in my book, I describe a sort of free-for-all in modern times of medical information about most anything. And I think that's a real issue. That's what the shouts refers to at the end, if you were part of the shouting. So people didn't used to talk about their illnesses. People hid their diseases, and now everyone is sharing their experiences. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're wrong. Some people are crazy. Some people are really, clever. I think the only way to protect ourselves is to be educated and be skeptical and to ask hard questions. And I think journalists also can be really helpful to the public in clarifying some of the information, as best you can.
Yeah, I mean, of course this intensified during COVID because we really didn't know anything when we first started out. But I think it happens really, cancer is filled with all kinds of false, hopes and people going on, because people, they want to live, and so they search for hope. But I agree very strongly with what Elaine said, which is really the only way through that is to continue to try to inform ourselves as best we can. I don't think we're ever going to fully stamp out misinformation. It's part of life, right? But I do think that if we are able to really view ourselves as partners and to share each of our expertise, I think it will go further together than we have in the past.
Yeah, there are agents of doubt and disinformation out there that are giving a platform and really, pouring gasoline on some of these ideas, setting them on fire pretty much. We know the TV networks and the publications and the platforms that are doing this. So, it's not just, there are institutional reasons why these things have gone wild as well. The interesting thing about the preprints is I got to be involved in a discussion about a study that looked at the validity of information in a preprint compared with its post-publication version, and there was strong validity after the review. When it was published, those preprints held water. So let's talk a little bit about the battle and war metaphors that come up a lot with disease and advocacy and efforts to change the system. There's been a lot of criticisms of that model. In cancer in particular, that was really championed, and I still hear it every time I'm watching a televised sport event. Our hearts go out to so-and-so's family member who's currently valiantly battling blah blah. So how can we do better there, or for some people, I think you said, Elaine, that was a helpful model and they wanted to feel like they were battling.
So the battle language, the battle metaphor, if you will, surrounding cancer is controversial. Most of you may have read Susan Sontag's work on this, but really it goes back 100 years. And what I learned in writing my book is that in the 70s and 80s in particular, when patients were rarely given voice and had little opportunity to question their doctors, many of the people I respected most, Audre Lorde, the poet, who had breast cancer and described her experience in the cancer journals, Gilda Radner, the comedian, others, Richard Block, who founded the tax form company, they chose to say they were fighting cancer. Why? Because it suggested for them that they were participating in the decisions and that they could do something. It made them more powerful to feel that they were fighting their disease. Of course, the problem with the cancer metaphor, with the battle metaphor, is that if people believe that they can fight cancer and then they succumb to the disease, they may feel that they failed, that they weren't strong enough. And that's a valid concern, and I think doctors should be mindful of that, and I think in general physicians should not use the metaphor because it suggests to the patient, it conveys the notion that cancer can be fought. But to me, after all this research I did, I kind of feel like if someone wants to say they're fighting their cancer, and they know that they can't do anything about it, if it makes them feel good just to say, I'm doing everything I can, I'm fighting this, it's not that big a deal to me. That's a controversial position among psychologists and some of my colleagues, but I just think that the main thing is that people understand that it's not their fault. And if they understand that and it gives them comfort to use a battle metaphor, who am I to judge that? It's not my choice of words, but I'm okay with it.
We're almost at time, but is there any comments you want to make that didn't come up today? Any main themes that we didn't get to the bottom of? Are we really saying, yes, we do need to storm the lab, but it's going to be a process. It might be bumpy, but things have to change?
Well, let's see. Storming the lab, I think, is a great title for a talk. It's so engaging, and it gets you to talk about the issues. But I think that, I'm not sure the people I wrote about were storming. What I would prefer to think about is, I'd like all of you to leave here feeling that you can make a difference. You can make a difference in your own lives, and you can make a difference in the lives of anyone you love who's sick. And that you should feel empowered. I mean, you're a future journalist, so you should especially feel empowered. You're probably really good at reading papers and asking hard questions and challenging the conventional wisdom. But I think that you don't have to be a journalist to feel that way. And I think that it does put a burden on a patient to have to fight for her life, but the reality is that we are going to have to fight for our lives. Because even when you have the best doctor in the world, no one can advocate for yourself as well as you can, and that is part of the process. So it's how can you find the people who are on, who put you at the center of things, who really try to reflect the values that you're trying to achieve, and you should feel empowered also to participate as much as you want to. You don't have to do everything, but as much as you want to, you should feel empowered to do it.
I think that's a great ending, Amy.
All right, we'll call it excellent. Thank you very much for your time and expertise.
I just want to say there's more to drink and eat. There's some dessert, some cookies. Feel free to hang out. I think our guests are willing to hang out for a few minutes.